When the celestial son of Asa bore the children of the stars, they were named Phoenix-born. And when they begun their rapid incinerating conquest of the eastern side of the continent of Kala, they were called the enemy. An enemy is exactly what Carmen the dwarf, who would eventually go on to be known as Carmen the Red, needed in order to forget her troublesome, unlucky, and tragic past. The enemy was as gifted as they were crafty, dousing in oils and setting themselves aflame as they marched and flew into battle. Fire never licked them, but scored a stroke on the soldiers of Kala that none of those still living could ever forget. The shrill screaming and trill of blazing barbarians set a weighty pit in any soldier's belly as those war cries carried across the hills. But Carmen fought the Phoenix-born with a ferocity and fearlessness few could match. She did not go unscathed, but her victories in bloody battle ensured relative peace for the people of Asa by the time the war was done. With her accomplishments came accolades, promotions, and status abound. However, in the background of her mind, she knew war was on another front. The Vigil Empire wrote to Carmen about the ongoing 1,000-year war against the dead. This dead army, called Du, had taken everything from her. They swelled in number from the western coast, threatening to overtake all of creation. And how could she fear them now, after having tasted victory against the once blazing starborn children of the sun? Carmen took it upon herself to face the horrors she met as a child. The enemy this time was a stark contrast from the Phoenix-born. Pallid of slowing, cold skin that wrapped itself on jagged black bones, their gnashing teeth, hollow eyes, and bony skinless fingers were always a grim reminder of the beyond and of the infection they carried that birthed their kind. Looking into the faces of those who were once counted among the living enraged Carmen. The trauma of what she once left behind bolstered her resolve, and with everything she had, she protected the realms of Asa. Her heroic and sometimes thoughtless sacrifices nearly cost her life when she was clawed and bitten by several Du at once, holding a choke point alone as a one-woman army against dozens of Du. A Herculean feat which sat on the fence between the sides of surprising and fitting to her platoon and her direct superiors. On her deathbed, when all seemed lost, she was saved by a man called Yevel. His name had been whispered and sung far and wide. Common folk and soldiers alike lined up along the countryside to meet the man for his healing ability. He was even so touched by apparent holiness that he could reverse the corruption of the Du to a certain extent, though purifying a complete takeover from the rot was simply beyond his means. He claimed to be one of the soul benders, which at first gave people pause, but he willingly lent his services to the Vigil army, sworn to cut the corruption of the Du wherever it arose. He left the camp shortly after healing her. He had apparently heard of her valor in the Phoenix-born war and recent victories against the Du, and made arrangements to seek out her encampment. He arrived solely to see her back on her feet and in the fight, claiming it was his duty as a soul bender. She wanted to thank him, and so set out to bring him under her command. Carmen had her wish. With the miracle healer Yevel at her beck and call, she could fight the Du even more recklessly than before. She worried less about her comrades and subordinates, never mind herself, until her trauma from her past was a small and distant memory. The only time Carmen ever had to be cautious was when it came to Yevel himself. He was competent enough, but no seasoned warrior like Carmen and the rest of her company. Many of them had even fought by her side against the Phoenixborn, while he grew up the son of a noble, living a gentle and sheltered life. He had never even killed before. Soon, Carmen's caution turned to anxiety, and then to worry, as their time together made her fonder of him. Fighting side by side, sharing meals, stories, gifts, favors, and company, Carmen always had Yevil to look after her when the fighting was done. But not all their time in her tent was spent healing wounds. Sometimes they merely talked. Sometimes there was no healing nor talking being done to speak of. Their feelings for one another developed naturally, and after years of pushing back the dew and convincing Vigil Command, the two settled down and retired to Rockwell Village of the Wilgreens. Nearly a year passed. Carmen and Yevil had enriching, satisfying lives together in the serenity of Rockwell. However, as they say, all good things must come to an inevitable and sour end. Yevil was given no choice but to return to the Vigil Vanguard way out west. The soldiers who conscripted him were met at the door by a swollen-bellied, waddling Carmen. It was bittersweet news to discover she was pregnant. They had intended to ferry them back to the battlefield as a couple. Yevil's departure was a tearful farewell. He promised to write, and he did so often, though eventually the fountain of letters to her became more like a droplet every once in a blue moon. And then they stopped altogether. Carmen soon after had a daughter with the help of her longtime friend Talia and her daughter-in-law Celeste. Unfortunately, but predictably, caring for a child was something Carmen seemingly had no talent, instinct, or interest for. Her thoughts always carried her to battle, then to Yevil. She couldn't forget him, and while she could live without her man, the longer she thought about it, the more it became unthinkable. If she were in danger, he was always there. And now able-bodied and no longer pregnant, she had no excuse not to return the favor. Not to her mind, anyway. She geared up in her regalia, sharpened her axe, and took one last look at the red-headed baby she brought into this world. It was a look stained with apathy. She shoved her infant daughter onto Talia, neglecting to even name her child before leaving. Whether she found Yevil or something that could be called his remains, Carmen the Dwarf, the Red, was never heard from again.